This brings us to DLQ01, a synthetic PGF2 Alpha analog that stimulates the PGF receptor in the hair follicle, right at the bottom of the follicle, that is, and this is where a structure known as the dermal papilla is, right? Which is very important for hair growth. It's like a generator to activate the hair follicle. Other receptors like PGE2 and PGF2 analogs, those bind to their respective receptor sites, and they can stimulate the hair follicle such that it grows hair. But yeah, my takeaway, my verdict on this is that DLQ01 looks to be very promising, and I'm, kind of disappointed that I let this go under my radar for so long. Hello everyone, and welcome back to yet another video. Today we're going to be talking about another hair loss drug that some of the subscribers in the audience have been requesting that I talk about, and it's called DLQ01, but I'll call it DLQ from now on. And it's by the pharmaceutical startup, or the biotech startup, Dermalic Therapeutics, headquartered in Wilmington, Delaware in the United States, with a subsidiary in Heidelberg, Germany. Now, there hasn't been any recent news that's making me do this video, but by popular demand, I'm going to do this for my audience. Anyway, DLQ is a prostaglandin F2 alpha analog, or PGF2 Alpha, designed to interact with the prostaglandin F receptor in the human hair follicle. Currently, there are drugs on the market that can stimulate this receptor. These drugs are Latanoprost, Bimatoprost, and Travoprost, and they have been used to treat ocular hypertension, also known as glaucoma. However, they have also been noted to cause a hypertrichosis effect, or an increase of hair, right, on eyelashes and even eyebrows. Some of you may recall the drug Latisse and how this solution is used to grow eyelashes, right? You have essentially a bristle-like wand that you put on your eyelashes around the eye area, and it can make your eyelashes grow longer and thicker. Well, in this particular solution, the active ingredient is Bimatoprost, and Bimatoprost is a prostaglandin F synthetic analog. And because it's been tested on people who have glaucoma, it's essentially eye-safe to use Latisse. Although it might not be safe for your bank account because it costs an arm and a leg, at least if you're getting it in the United States of America. However, much like Minoxidil, the exact mechanism of action in which these prostaglandin analogs, the synthetic analogs that is, work to grow hair, isn't exactly or precisely understood. But what are prostaglandins? Well, according to Stats Pearl's article from Kashif Malik and Antarpreet Dua, titled, quote, Prostaglandins, unquote, prostaglandins are a group of naturally occurring fatty acid compounds that have several important functions in the body. They are produced in almost all tissues and organs and are derived from arachidonic acid. Prostaglandins help regulate biological processes such as inflammation, blood flow, the formation of blood clots, and even the induction of child labor. So, women in the audience, I guess you can thank prostaglandins for helping you deliver your baby. Or more so the doctor, that is. But going back to the topic, they work by binding to specific receptors on the surface of cells, triggering various cellular responses. For example, some prostaglandins can relax or tighten blood vessels, while others can influence pain and inflammation, and some are involved in the healing and repair processes. You can think of prostaglandins as messages in the body that help manage how cells respond to an injury, illness, or stress, similar to how sending out an email with instructions to different departments in a company tells them what to do in various situations and circumstances. But when it comes to hair loss, there are prostaglandins that are good for, keeping hair in a state of growth, and then there are prostaglandins that are typically bad and lead to inflammation, oxidative stress, and eventually the miniaturization of the hair follicle. According to the literature review titled, quote, Does prostaglandin D2 hold the cure to male pattern baldness, unquote, by Ashley Neves and Dr. Luis A. Garza. According to the literature review, prostaglandins such as PGF2 Alpha and PGE2 are known to support hair growth, whereas prostaglandin D2 or PGD2 is associated with the inhibition of hair growth or the prevention of hair growth. The review specifically states that, quote, prostaglandins often have opposing functions, unquote, which goes to show that while PGD2 inhibits hair growth, other prostaglandins like PGE2 and PGF2 Alpha stimulate it. PGD2 specifically has a negative impact in cases of androgenetic alopecia, where it binds to the GPR44 receptor, also known as the prostaglandin D2 receptor in hair follicles, which leads to shorter hair growth cycles due to a host of downstream effects coming from the result of binding to this receptor. This prostaglandin D2 receptor essentially acts as a docking station for PGD2, triggering signals that, again, inhibit hair growth. So essentially, while we have other receptors like PGE2 and PGF2 analogs, those bind to their respective receptor sites, and they can stimulate the hair follicle such that it grows hair. So it really goes to show how bad PGD2 is, and how potentially, when we have issues with alopecia of any kind, we want to decrease PGD2 where we can. And curiously enough, even in the case of minoxidil, it's theorized to utilize prostaglandins like PGE2 to aid in hair growth. And we get this understanding from the study titled, quote, Activation of Cytoprotective Prostaglandin Synthesis 1 by Minoxidil as a Possible Explanation for its Hair Growth Stimulating Effect, unquote, by Bernard et al., 1997. And it's in this particular paper that found minoxidil activating an enzyme known as prostaglandin endoperoxide synthesis 1, or PGHS1, also known as COX1 or COX1. Get your mind out of the gutter, okay? Which leads to increased production of PGE2, playing a significant role in promoting hair growth. So this enzyme, again, this enzyme PGHS1, primarily it's found in the dermal papilla of the hair follicles. So that is at the literal base of the hair follicle. I'll try to show some graphics over here on the screen. But this is the sort of power plant of the hair follicle, where if you can stimulate it correctly, you can get further cell type differentiation that ultimately builds the hair out of the hair follicle. PGHS1 can also convert its substrate into PGD2 under certain genetic triggers, such as increased DHT levels in androgenetic alopecia. So PGHS1, or COX1, same enzyme here that we're talking about, is an enzyme that can either lead to the production of good prostaglandins like PGF2 Alpha or PGE2, but it can also turn into the bad prostaglandin boogeyman that we're talking about, PGD2. It mostly depends on the genetic conditions that are being initiated from some sort of other, environmental trigger. And that trigger would activate the genes that can either express more of those good prostaglandins or more of those bad prostaglandins. But the story is like this, right? PGHS1 or COX1 converts arachidonic acid into prostaglandin H2 or PGH2. Then PGH2 is metabolized by specific enzymes to create various prostaglandins. So it's now going to branch off into the either good prostaglandins or bad prostaglandins. So it depends on what genes are being activated by certain cells or certain processes that either turn on specific enzymes to kind of differentiate into the good prostaglandin tree or the bad prostaglandin tree, or really, essentially, there is no good or bad. It depends on the condition that you're dealing with, but I'll just break it down that way, right? You need certain enzymes to be activated that will either give you the PGD2 branch or the PGE2 and PGF2 alpha branch. So in order to get the PGD2 enzyme, an enzyme known as prostaglandin D synthase, or PGDS, converts PGH2 into PGD2. Now, there are two isoforms of PGDS. One, the lipocalin type, or the LPGDS type, and the second one is the hematopoietic type, or the HPGDS, which are used depending on the cell type and tissue. Up next, prostaglandin E synthase, or PGES, converts PGH2 to PGE2. Like PGDS, there are different isoforms of PGES, including the microsomal PGES1, PGES2, and cytosolic PGES, which all vary based on their cellular location, tissue type, and other sort of regulatory functions. Prostaglandin F synthase, or PGFS, converts PGH2 to PGF2 alpha. This enzyme also exists in different forms, including aldose reductase, which plays a role in converting PGH2 to PGF2 alpha in certain tissues. So going back to the study by Bernard et al., it suggests that non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, also known as NSAIDs, blocks and reduces PGHS1, also known as COX-1, COX-1. So, in observing this mechanism of action, a key component of minoxidil's mechanism, which involves the use of prostaglandins for hair growth, suggests that the use of NSAID drugs like aspirin may hinder minoxidil's efficacy because it interacts with PGHS1, aka COX-1, and reduces or blocks the use of those particular enzymes. And if those enzymes aren't in abundance, then you're not even going to get as much PGD2 or PGE2 altogether. And minoxidil, in that respect, could very well have its efficacy hindered. And also, just as a side note, I think it's also important to kind of take in genetic variation into account. Somebody may have genes that are just more inclined to produce PGD2, which could put them at a predisposed risk for other health conditions and even certain hair loss conditions as well. And likewise, the same thing could be said for PGE2, right? Even having too much PGE2, which we'll touch on later on in the video, that can be bad for you. But in any case, if we look at another study titled, quote, "Low-dose daily aspirin reduces topical minoxidil's efficacy in androgenetic alopecia patients," unquote, by Gorin et al. 2018, this study also supports the same premise, right? NSAIDs reduce the efficacy of minoxidil. So it shows the importance of these prostaglandins as well as their enzymes and how minoxidil kind of uses these prostaglandins as a toolbox to build hair. But again, the full mechanism of action is somewhat of a mystery when it comes to minoxidil. I'll say this, right? If somebody requires an NSAID for, let's say, chronic pain or some pain condition, then using an NSAID that inhibits PGHS2 or COX-2, its other name, those particular enzymes, that might be more suitable because it looks like minoxidil just requires PGHS1, also known as COX-1, to create those prostaglandins that it will use to grow hair. So the NSAIDs that are used to inhibit PGHS2 or COX-2 are meloxicam or celecoxib, and they could be more suitable. But really, again, if you're dealing with pain issues, it's probably better to just use those pain medications when you need it. And if you're chronically using it, that in and of itself has other sort of health implications that you should probably be checked by a doctor for, and really just solving that baseline chronic pain issue. But in any case, even if you are using NSAIDs because you have to and you still want to keep your head of hair, and you don't want to disrupt the efficacy of the minoxidil that you're using, right? There are some potential solutions. Because since it seemingly is the case that minoxidil uses PGE2 and PGF2 as tools to grow hair, using topical minoxidil with a PGF2 Alpha or PGE2 analog of some kind like Latanoprost, Bimatoprost, or Travoprost could theoretically enhance minoxidil's efficacy even if NSAIDs are used. Because you are artificially adding those prostaglandin analogs, you don't have to wait for the enzyme PGHS1 or COX-1 or PGHS2 or COX-2 to create those prostaglandin analogs. And this can also help somebody who may not be responding well topically and even orally to minoxidil's use. Let's say you're using oral minoxidil and you're not getting the best response on your scalp. Maybe you can use Latanoprost, Bimatoprost, or Travoprost to theoretically increase those prostaglandins locally so minoxidil can actually make use of it. But if we're going to go down this route anyway, let's examine other avenues where there might be a bottleneck on minoxidil's efficacy. So another factor in preventing minoxidil from working effectively could be minoxidil sulfation. So minoxidil sulfate is a prodrug of minoxidil, but it is the key driver of hair growth in human hair follicles. The study titled, quote, "Minoxidil sulfotransferase, a marker of human keratinocyte differentiation," unquote, by Garland A. Johnson et al. 1992, shows us how the enzyme sulfotransferase needs to be reasonably abundant to convert minoxidil to its active form, minoxidil sulfate. And to get an understanding of minoxidil sulfate a bit more, we can even look at a case report series titled, quote, "Systemic minoxidil accidental exposure in a pediatric population, a case series study of cutaneous and systemic side effects," unquote. And this is by Manuel Sanchez Diaz et al., published in 2021 in the Journal of Clinical Medicine. So essentially, we have a case series where children have accidentally orally consumed minoxidil. The authors go over some of the side effects being low blood pressure and also hypertrichosis, but they link that to the result of minoxidil sulfate's action. So minoxidil has to be converted into minoxidil sulfate in order to have these sort of effects. Now, interestingly enough, it also mentioned prostaglandin E2 or PGE2 production. The authors state that, quote, at the biochemical level, minoxidil is able to induce several changes in the expression of different molecules. Minoxidil increases vascular endothelial growth factor, also known as VEGF, levels, hypoxia-inducible factor 1 alpha, and prostaglandin E2 production. These biochemical changes may modify the microenvironment of the hair follicle, including a prolonged anagen phase and increased hair growth. It is thought that the action of minoxidil on hair growth is mainly due to minoxidil sulfate, a metabolite of minoxidil. The enzyme responsible for its generation is sulforotransferase, which is located in hair follicles. End of quote. Essentially, the authors go on to talk about how the genes that control for sulforotransferase enzymatic activity varies between one person to another, so this is what gives the varied response of minoxidil and minoxidil sulfate at that its sort of efficacy. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it can influence PGE2 along with impacting potassium channels. All of this together can sort of cause hair growth effects, but also reduce blood pressure. So what are other ways to increase sulforotransferase enzymatic activity? So if we were to use prostaglandin analogs like Latanoprost, Bimatoprost, or Travoprost, is there another way outside of using minoxidil sulfate to grow hair? Because minoxidil sulfate is very unstable in an aqueous solution, so it's going to be hard to kind of deliver that to the hair follicle. Well, we have some small studies that indicate that retinoids such as tretinoin and even potentially adapaline and even tazarotene, and these may stimulate sulforotransferase levels and may be used to enhance minoxidil's conversion to minoxidil sulfate, as suggested by studies like, quote, efficacy of 5% minoxidil versus combined 5% minoxidil and 0.01% tretinoin for male pattern hair loss, a randomized double-blind comparative clinical trial, unquote, by Shin et al. 2007, and the paper titled, quote, promotive effect of minoxidil combined with all trans-retinoic acid, tretinoin, on human hair growth in vitro, unquote, by Kwon et al. 2007. Now, if I had to sort of give a marker on the effective concentrations, I would say probably for tretinoin, the higher you can get, or the closer rather you can get to 0.1%, right? The closer you can get to that being the maximal amount, the better sulforotransferase enzymatic activity you will have. Likewise, with adapaline between 1 to 3%, I wouldn't really go above that, just personally speaking. And tazarotene, this is pretty strong. I would probably just stay at the 0.1% concentration. But moving back to the whole minoxidil sulfate kind of thing, you can either use a liposomal option or a lipid delivery system for minoxidil sulfate that could be useful here, as demonstrated by Dr. Trueb in the paper titled, quote, efficacy, tolerability, and superiority of propylene glycol-free North American witch hazel-based solution of 5% minoxidil sulfate for the treatment of female androgenetic alopecia, unquote. And in this particular paper, we have women who weren't responding to both topical and oral minoxidil, and after using this, it seemed to have helped. So we can see in the literature the significance of prostaglandins in hair growth, and also in general when it comes to the human body's functions. We have some studies that we can look at which aren't the best, but they provide a basis for why DLQ01 may actually be an effective growth stimulant and why we should probably take Dermalic's phase 1 results seriously. So the following papers are going to concern prostaglandin analogs, synthetic or natural, as well as how potentially modulating the prostaglandin environment, all that to do with prostaglandins, can impact hair growth cycles. So in the paper titled, quote, eyelash growth in subjects treated with bimatoprost, a multi-center randomized double-masked vehicle-controlled parallel group study, unquote, by Stacy Smith et al., published in the Journal of American Academy of Dermatology in May 2012. The efficacy of bimatoprost at 0.03% in enhancing eyelash growth was investigated. This 5-month clinical trial involved 278 subjects, with 137 receiving bimatoprost and 141 receiving a placebo vehicle. The study found that a significantly higher percentage of subjects in the bimatoprost group showed improved eyelash prominence compared to the vehicle group, with notable increases in length, thickness, and darkness of the eyelashes. A key strength of this study was its randomized, double-blind, also termed as in this paper, double-masked design, which enhances the reliability of these findings. But, of course, every study seems to have some limitations, including this one, because this study may have been a bit short. Usually, what you typically, again, see is the studies being around for 6 months to maybe a year. But, I mean, this is cutting in at the 5-month mark, so I don't really think it's too much of an issue. But in any case, this is a pretty good study because it shows conclusive evidence that bimatoprost, at least when it comes to eyelashes, seems to stimulate them and causes them to have a hypertrichosis effect or a hair growth effect on those eyelash hair follicles. The next paper titled, quote, Bimatoprost in the Treatment of Eyelash Hypotrichosis, unquote, by Simon K. Law, published in Clinical Ophthalmology in 2010, shows the effectiveness of bimatoprost at 0.03% in treating eyelash hypotrichosis. And hypotrichosis means essentially you have fewer hairs than normal in an area due to some sort of condition, right? And this paper serves as a sort of literature review that looks at a significant number of studies that shows how bimatoprost at 0.03% and how this prostaglandin analog, this prostaglandin F2 analog, alpha analog, seems to be useful in increasing eyelash length, thickness, and darkness. Now, the next study doesn't necessarily have to do with prostaglandin analogs being used themselves, but it does have to do with modulating the prostaglandin environment. The study titled, quote, A Preliminary Study on Topical Cetirizine in the Therapeutic Management of Androgenetic Alopecia, unquote, by Rossi et al., examines the effectiveness of topical cetirizine for treating androgenetic alopecia. The research involved 85 patients with 67 receiving cetirizine treatment and 18 serving as controls. That seems kind of weird and lopsided, I'm not going to lie. Ideally, you would try to split them in half. I don't know why they wanted such a few amount of people in control, but okay, whatever. Anyway, the results indicated a significant increase in the total hair density, terminal hair density, and hair shaft diameter, alongside a decrease in vellus hair density. So it actually decreased the density of vellus hairs, or the occurrence of vellus hairs. Maybe a lot of those vellus hairs transformed into intermediate hairs. Who knows? But again, it's kind of weird to have a placebo group of only 18 people, while you have your treatment group at 67 people. Because any minor changes in the 18 people, right, compared to the 67 people, can be very much amplified, and it can kind of mess with the results. So that's a really, really bad design over here, if I have to jump in and criticize. But a key aspect of this study is the mechanism by which cetirizine operates. Unlike common treatments that directly stimulate hair growth or alter some sort of hormonal level, cetirizine does not act as a prostaglandin analog, but it's known to reduce levels of PGD2. And this is a prostaglandin that's linked to hair loss like we talked about before. So perhaps this could be why some people saw some sort of therapeutic benefit, but the strength of the study is very weak. It has a small sample size, a very weird sort of partition between the treatment group and the placebo group. But nevertheless, if I'm going to talk about the literature, I have to include this study. But there was a follow-up to that study titled, quote, Efficacy of cetirizine 1% versus minoxidil 5% topical solution in the treatment of male alopecia, a randomized single-blind controlled study, unquote, by Mustafa et al. 2021, which involved 40 men between the ages of 18 to 49 who were randomly divided into 2 equal groups for either 1% cetirizine or 5% minoxidil. This was a 16-week study, so it's kind of short, and it followed up with an 8-week drug-free phase after the first part of the study was completed. The findings from this study indicated that 1% cetirizine was inferior to 5% minoxidil. While we're at that, there are some patents concerning the use of travoprost a strong prostaglandin F2 alpha analog, typically used for glaucoma. But in this patent from Galderma Research and Development, SNC, that's the company, it could be used for combating androgenetic alopecia. So I think that's also an interesting avenue that should be researched a bit more, maybe with compounding pharmacies and such. Also, because I love talking about this receptor so much, the PPAR gamma receptor, let's bring in this particular condition called lichen planopilaris. Because over here, prostaglandins play a crucial role in stimulating the PPAR gamma receptor. But also, this might tell us a different sort of angle where having too much PGE2 could potentially harm this, delicate balance of having PGD2 and PGE2 or PGF2 as well. The condition known as lichen planopilaris comprises a family of cicatricial lymphatic alopecias. Essentially, these are scarring alopecias that are due to some sort of dysfunction caused by the PPAR gamma receptor that elicits an autoimmune response that causes your lymphocytes and other white blood cells to attack and destroy the hair follicle organ, destroying important structures like the sebaceous glands, as well as the very important stem cell bulge. Now, if you don't have this stem cell bulge, then the hair follicle can't grow because these stem cells exist in that structure and it regulates the anagen cycle of the hair follicle, the growth cycle of the hair follicle. So if PPAR gamma receptors are downregulated, this leads to various dysfunctions that causes this sort of horrible hair loss condition that leads to permanent hair loss. Because it's in this dysfunctional environment, a condition known as lipotoxicity occurs, which means there's too much lipids and your body wants to destroy the things that are kind of creating these lipids, being these sebaceous glands and the cells that are inside them called sebocytes. But it causes for that sort of inflamed environment, hyper-inflamed environment that destroys so much of those hair follicles. And you can learn more by reading the paper titled, quote, PPAR gamma agonist and their role in primary cicatricial alopecia, unquote, by Sararan Horeng-Chuang and Poonkind Shachuanit. So you're probably wondering, why are prostaglandins important here? Well, remember that prostaglandins themselves are lipids, and the PPAR gamma receptor responds to ligands or lipids. And these ligands activate the receptor to turn on certain genes that are important for metabolizing lipids and essentially filtering out the environment and keeping a sort of homeostasis so there aren't too many lipids or too few lipids, which could disrupt the environment and can prevent cells from proliferating, duplicating, right? And differentiating, becoming, different cells. This is very crucial for hair growth. So to reiterate here, you need a balance between PGE2, PGF2, and even PGD2, because some prostaglandins can interact with the PPAR gamma receptor indirectly or directly. PGE2, for instance, does not interact with PPAR gamma receptor. On the other hand, PGD2 is not an effective stimulator of this receptor. According to the research detailed in the paper titled, quote, novel prostaglandin D2 derived activators of peroxisome proliferator activated receptor gamma or PPAR gamma are formed in macrophage cell cultures, unquote, by Christopher K. Glass and colleagues. PGD2 itself acts as a poor ligand or a poor activator of the PPAR gamma receptor. To address this, researchers explored how PGD2 could be converted into its metabolites within macrophage cell cultures to better activate the PPAR gamma receptor. The study found some pretty interesting things. That during the metabolic process, PGD2 is transformed into several distinct metabolites, and some of these metabolites demonstrate a significantly enhanced ability to activate the PPAR gamma receptor, such as 15-DPGJ2, such a mouthful of a word, which is a very well-studied metabolite due to its role as a natural ligand for the PPAR gamma receptor. I think it's worth noting that PGD2 can turn into a PGF alpha derivative metabolite known as 9-alpha-11-beta PGF2 alpha. That particular PGF alpha sort of derivative can also bind to prostaglandin F2 receptors and serve as a natural PGF analog which could, in theory, like bimatoprost, latanoprost, and travoprost, stimulate hair growth. But I guess it depends where this is occurring, right? If it's occurring in the dermal papilla cells, then yeah, it'll kind of stimulate hair growth there. If it's not and it's occurring in macrophages, it can activate different genes in there too. And to be fair, this is a study about macrophages. But I'm going to assume that, maybe it could extend itself to other parts of the hair follicle environment. And if not, it's a sort of immunomodulatory kind of ligand. But with that rambling out of the way, isn't it weird, right? Because we like to think that PGE2 production, as well as PGF2 Alpha, is good because it decreases PGD2, whether directly or indirectly. And PGE2 and PGF2 seem to help hair grow, right? As we know from the PGF analogs, latanoprost, bimatoprost, and travoprost. But in theory, if there are a considerable decline in PGD2 and its metabolites, and those metabolites are known to directly stimulate the PPAR gamma receptor, this could cause a downregulation of the PPAR gamma receptor and lead to a more lipotoxic environment, as other lipids may not be as good of sort of stimulants to the PPAR gamma receptor, and then they might begin to accumulate, and that leads to lipotoxicity. It leads to the lymphocytic infiltrate that ultimately destroys the cells that are producing the bad sebum, right? The bad lipids, as well as the malformed PPAR gamma receptors. So balancing PGD2 and PGE2 levels through targeted therapies could therefore offer new strategies for managing hair loss conditions by manipulating key prostaglandin pathways. But that's enough rambling about prostaglandins. We can clearly see how important they are when it comes to hair growth, but the main takeaway here is that generally speaking, PGE2 and PGF natural or synthetic analogs seem to stimulate hair growth from hair follicles. And this brings us to DLQ01, a synthetic PGF2 Alpha analog that stimulates the PGF receptor in the hair follicle, right at the bottom of the follicle, that is, and this is where a structure known as the dermal papilla is, right? Which is very important for hair growth. It's like a generator to activate the hair follicle. So, on July 16th, 2024, Dermalic Therapeutics announced successful outcomes from a 6-month Phase 1b/2a clinical trial of DLQ01, a prostaglandin F2 alpha analog designed for the treatment of androgenetic alopecia in men. Conducted at Sinclair Dermatology in Melbourne, Australia, the trial involved 120 men aged 18 to 60 with vertex balding. Participants applied DLQ01 twice daily over the course of the study, resulting in a significant increase in target area hair counts by 12.3% from baseline, with an 83% responder rate. This efficacy surpassed that of the known comparative treatment Minoxidil, which achieved a 9.8% increase. So it seems like those two margins are pretty wide, favoring DLQ01. But unless they, go head to head, let's not take that a bit, seriously, right? Unless Minoxidil goes head to head with DLQ01, then we can examine who the real winner is. But anyway, DLQ01 was well tolerated with no significant adverse cutaneous events leading to treatment discontinuation. And this news is relatively promising, especially when you read the literature about prostaglandin analogs, particularly the F2 alpha analog variety. And because of what we know about Minoxidil and prostaglandin F analogs or F2 alpha analogs, it is possible that we can stack Minoxidil with DLQ01 if it comes out. But using this with androgenetic alopecia alone probably won't be, too effective, right? Because we know with Minoxidil, with long-term use, if you're not using a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor for the condition of androgenetic alopecia, eventually DHT damages the hair follicle so much that the growth sort of, stimulatory signals that you get from Minoxidil and even its prostaglandin interactions won't be enough to save the follicle. And likely the same may be said for lichen planopilaris, right? If you aren't treating that sort of PPAR gamma dysfunction, And maybe, I guess you can debate that, okay, maybe the ligand from the prostaglandin F2 alpha analog can sort of stimulate the, the PPAR gamma receptor, as we've found out from the Christopher K. Glass and colleagues paper. But you would probably benefit by using some sort of agonist or stimulator, direct stimulator of the PPAR gamma receptor, like pioglitazone. So again, you have to solve the baseline condition that's destroying the hair follicle before you can worry about using any sort of growth stimulant. Unless it's something like PP405 from Palage Pharmaceutical, which through its mechanism of action seems to suggest that it works really, really well to the point where it can override any sort of damaging effects that DHT can, sort of elicit on the follicle. But that remains to be seen. Generally speaking, though, you're not going to get away with using, let's say, a growth stimulant on its own and not worrying about the underlying cause of your alopecia condition, whether it's in androgenetic alopecia, it's DHT, or whether in lichen planopilaris and other sort of cicatricial lymphocytic hair loss conditions, whether it's, a dysfunction of the PPAR gamma receptor. So the takeaway there, solve your underlying condition with a drug of some kind, whether it's DHT, finasteride, whether topically or orally, dutasteride topically or orally, or with lichen planopilaris, pioglitazone, whether topically or orally. But yeah, my takeaway, my verdict on this is that DLQ01 looks to be very promising, and I'm, kind of disappointed that I let this go under my radar for so long. But thanks to the audience that kept urging me to look into this, I did look into this. And originally this video wasn't supposed to be so long, but I couldn't help myself. So guys, please pray for my editor because he's doing a lot of work. Neil, we shout out to Neil, bro. We love his contributions to the channel. Best editor that I've had. Right next to Alessandro, though. I got to give Alessandro respect for helping with various videos. But other than that, thank you guys for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace out.